Welcome to the second installment of the Debate Fundamentals. Today, we'll be going over what exactly arguments are, all the categories of debate arguments, and how to use them. Now, people have categorized arguments in all sorts of ways for many different purposes, but for public forum and for debate generally, we can build up our own set of argumentative concepts. At the most fundamental level, making an argument begins with making a claim, or a statement of truth about the world. For example, someone could say, the sun is not purple. Now, I like this one because it's pretty easy. While the claim seems obvious, just saying that the sun isn't purple is not enough to prove that claim. It's empty without a warrant or an explanation for why the claim is true. So, why isn't the sun purple? Well, we can look up and all see it, and our eyes don't seem to lie to us. And if we tested the wavelengths of the color, it probably would not appear purple. All of that gives us reason to believe the original claim. And thus, a claim with a warrant produces an argument. So, what type of argument is a debate round? The resolution is itself a claim, making a statement about what some actor, usually the US federal government or the USFG, should do. Each team is tasked with affirming or negating that position, and each of the subsequent arguments are themselves warrants for each of those overarching claims. When each team makes an argument in favor of affirming or negating, they are making a claim and then backing that up with individual arguments that chain into their own warrants. So, for example, if the resolution was that the USFG should implement a universal healthcare system, we'd begin the affirmative and negative chains by asking why we'd affirm and negate, and each answer would itself be a claim that we'd have to back up with additional arguments. So, say on the negative, you would argue that a universal healthcare program could cause immense debt, but making this argument would require proving why a program would cost a lot, why it would be financed by debt, and then arguments about why debt is bad. Each of those comes with their own burdens and thus their own warrants. When teams start making responses, which are themselves claims with warrants, we get a lot of arguments. So, how can we organize all of these arguments so we know what's going on? Well, in debate, there are two broad categories of arguments: offense and defense. Because the resolution is a policy question, asking whether a government actor should do something, we have both positive reasons to affirm or negate, or offense, and arguments that are denying the claim of another argument, or defense. Let's spell this out further. Starting with offense, let's just think of this as arguments that are in favor of doing or not doing something. The most important argumentative structure in debate, other than the claim and warrant, are the three pieces of an offensive argument: uniqueness, link, and impact. Let's make sense of these three pieces with our example. If we argue in favor of a universal healthcare program, an offensive argument would be that this program could increase access to essential healthcare for thousands of people. The uniqueness to this argument would be that right now, people are lacking healthcare access due to very high medical costs, and many people have to take on a lot of debt to compensate for this. One could find evidence supporting this claim and add that as support to their explanations. The link would be that a universal government program could guarantee every citizen access using public funds, and that the USFG has the financial capacity to take this on. If more people have healthcare, there are two impacts. First, less people need to take on impoverishing medical debt, which burdens families. And second, improved healthcare access reduces mortality from poor access now. To fully terminalize both of these impacts, you'd want to find estimation studies or other indicators of how many people each impact actually affects. This gives us a full offensive argument because it has all of the needed pieces. And notice the function that each of these pieces played. Uniqueness describes the background to the resolution. It's essentially what's happening right now. and we'll sometimes refer to it as the status quo or the squo. We like shortcuts. This is because of what comes next, the link. Now, this is what happens when we assume the resolution is implemented into the world and it leads to some change we do or don't like. This generally also describes the immediate consequences of implementing the resolution in your offensive argument, such as a healthcare program leading to more healthcare access. The impact describes why the link matters, usually why something is good or bad. It gives the judge a reason to value your argument. In our example, the impact was that healthcare access is good because right now it's costly and that leads to a lot of debt, and more access can save lives. You should also terminalize these impacts if you remember from before. Try to find the full chain of arguments that explains why something matters. And this usually involves providing as much clarity as your impact can, including statistical estimates for what specific consequences you link into. For our example, we'd want quantifications of our poverty or mortality impacts, or similar indicators of what the impact is. Remember these categories. Every offensive argument requires all three, so hold yourself and your opponents to that standard and make sure that none of them go overlooked. Sometimes, offensive arguments can assume obvious things about the status quo or about what's happening right now. For example, you wouldn't need to prove that there's a presidential election coming up this year. Just remember to provide an explicit argument where it's likely needed. When you read whole offensive arguments in your constructive speeches or your case, they're generally called contentions to distinguish them from other offensive arguments. After the two constructive speeches, both offensive and defensive arguments are read as responses. So let's organize those. Beginning with defense, these are the most standard types of responses. Now let's name out 4 basic types, but it's really just 3. Now first we have a mitigation, or a response that doesn't completely deny any of the 3 claims in an argument, but instead argues that they're overstated and the argument overall is not as significant as it's made out to be. Second, we have a non-unique, which essentially argues that the other team is wrong about their uniqueness. If a team makes a claim about what's happening right now in the status quo, and that the resolution changes that, a non-unique says the change is already happening or happened, and thus the uniqueness is backwards and the argument is non-unique. Third, we have just standard defense or denials of something that your opponent claims. These are often called delinks when read against a link and impact defense when read against the impact, but they don't technically differ other than applying a defensive argument against a different section of a case. And so, the final type of defense is terminal defense, which can be tricky, but that's fine. While normal defense would deny a basic claim's truth, terminal defense would argue that a claim is not possible and thus terminally incorrect. Once famously said, say we wanted to chop down a bunch of trees. Well, normal defense would argue that it could be expensive, we need to find the workers, it would be difficult, we don't know where we'd get the trees. Terminal defense would say that the world ran out of chainsaws and axes and everyone forgot magically how to make new ones, absolutely preventing us from chopping down trees. The distinction between terminal and normal defense isn't too far off from what we see with normal defense and mitigations, where the difference comes down to how much flexibility or room you're leaving for your opponent when they want to defend their argument. On the other hand, offensive arguments that we don't call contentions can be broken down into a few boxes. First, we have turns. These are the most basic offensive responses, simply saying that the opponent's argument flows in the opposite logical direction and is thus a reason to vote against them. If the AF says the resolution leads to more of something, a turn says the resolution actually leads to less of it, or that whatever the AF links into is actually bad and a reason to negate. As we can see, there are 2 basic types of turns. The first are link turns. Now these flip the link or argue that the resolution leads to the opposite outcome of the opponent's link chain. However, remember that in order for an offensive argument to be complete, it needs all 3 pieces of an argument, while a link turn steals the impact by just flipping the link, a non-unique, or a response to the uniqueness, is needed alongside the link turn to provide new uniqueness to this new link into the same impact. For example, if we said that right now we have no B, whatever B is, and A leads to more B, and that B is good, this is a complete argument. A link turn would say that A actually causes less B, and thus it's a reason to vote against that team. However, notice that because there's no response to the uniqueness, that right now there's no B, there's no actual offense generated by this argument. Instead, it could just be defense, rephrased as A does not lead to more B, with the warrant for that claim being that A leads to less B. However, if a uniqueness response is read, saying that we have B now, the argument would be a link turn and generate offense off of making the world actually have less B. And remember, both sides use the same impact here, that B is good. The second type of turns are impact turns. These assume the entire argument up to the impact is true and just flip something about the impact, usually going from something being good to something being bad, or vice versa. Back to our quick example, we would ignore everything with the link turns and just argue that B is bad, turning the argument as a whole into a reason to vote against your opponent by honing in on their impact. Alongside turns, independent offense describes offensive responses that neither interfere with the link or flip the impact of a contention, but instead present their own uniqueness and the link chain, and sometimes even a new impact. In public forum, we like the term disadvantage, or DA, to describe independent offensive arguments read in rebuttal. Now, you can almost think of a DA as a new contention, but they can sometimes share the impact of the original contention, essentially acting as a contrasting argument linking into the same impact. Finally, for offensive and defensive arguments alike, if you notice that one or two responses tend to apply to multiple of your opponent's contentions, you can just read those at the very top of your speech or the beginning of rebuttal and call it an overview. Offensive and defensive overviews provide judges with easy ways to vote for you against multiple contentions that you can just group together. So that was a lot, but let's go back to our example to give these concepts some substance. We have our full argument, or contention, for why a universal healthcare program could be good. But let's start with some defensive responses, and then we'll also layer on some offense. So first, we can mitigate it. We can say that there will be funding shortcuts and that not everyone will receive the benefits of signing up for this program. Second, we can non-unique it. Joe Biden's going to win a supermajority in 2024. This is going to allow us to expand healthcare access and probably solve the majority of their uniqueness about a lack of healthcare access now. Third, we can delink it, because US healthcare supply chains would collapse if there was a spike in demand, preventing any increase in access. Fourth, some terminal defense, because state Supreme Courts would rule it unconstitutional and shut the program down, and the US Supreme Court would rule that states are allowed to decide for themselves. And fifth, on the impacts, you can group them. Government healthcare would be so bad, it would have no impact on health overall, so people would still take on debt at other private facilities. Now that we have some defense, let's add some offense. First, on the link, you can turn it. A government program would replace private systems, but it would be much slower and in lower quality, leading to worse overall healthcare access for everyone. Second, a disadvantage, as public opposition to this resolution would spur a wave of election losses for Democrats, leading to less medical aid being sent to developing countries globally. Notice how we got to use every response but the impact turn. This is because we read a link turn and a disadvantage that linked into the same impact of healthcare access, simply on a global level. If we read an impact turn on this argument saying healthcare is bad, we'd have double turned ourselves, or given the opponent an easy new argument because of all the arguments we already read about our side increasing healthcare access. While offense and defense explain the essence of debate, two sets of arguments are somewhat unique. The first are frontlines and spikes. Now, just for some working definitions, frontlines, if you remember, are responses that you read in defense of your constructive speech or your case, while spikes are preemptive frontlines embedded into your case to take out or prevent the reading of certain responses. They're essentially defense, but they're read for the purpose of obtaining or defending an offensive argument. Now, frontlines and spikes go hand in hand because the process of developing frontlines to defend your case creates the arguments that you embed into constructive as spikes. So, as you face more responses against your case and realize where the strong and weak points are, use prepared front lines and turn them into spikes so you have an advantage by placing supporting arguments where you might need them. But the second unique type of argument in debate is weighing, which is the comparison of how important different arguments are, or specifically, comparing how important their impacts are. Now, weighing is essential in every round, especially in summary and final focus. In many rounds, both teams will make good arguments. Very often, both teams can win offense going into the last speeches. Weighing gives the judge a way to prioritize one argument over another. There are a few basic weighing mechanisms you'll be using. Now, the first is probability, which weighs arguments based on the likelihood that they'll occur. The second is magnitude, which weighs the severity of the impact. And the third is the scope, which just weighs how many people your impact affects. Now, another important mechanism is time frame, or the way that your impact occurs over time. So, for example, some impacts are very short term, only have an effect for a small period of time. There are other impacts that can continue occurring for years or decades, long term impacts that accumulate more effects over time. Long term impacts might also be impacts that don't start until far in the future, that might have slow causal mechanisms. However, notice that simply explaining impacts as short or long term doesn't constitute weighing itself. A warrant is needed for why short or long term arguments come first or outweigh against their alternative. For example, one team could argue that short term arguments come first because intervening actors, or just other institutions and people in the world other than the resolution, are more likely to solve long term impacts without this topic than they are to solve very urgent short term issues that are about to happen. So, if someone else is going to solve the long term problem, we should focus on the short term one. But on the other side, the other team could argue that long term arguments outweigh on scope because they impact more people over time and link into one of the original weighing mechanisms. So, for example, if we were going to weigh the impact of healthcare against a recession, we would say a few things. First, we could argue that healthcare outweighs on probability because lots of actors want to prevent recessions and they dedicate efforts towards doing that, so their argument isn't likely. However, the affirmative establishes a government program backed by public funds, which makes it very likely to happen. Second, we outweigh on magnitude. Recessions may lead to short term poverty, but healthcare access saves lives, and that's a permanent impact. Third, we outweigh on scope, because a recession is just short term, while we increase healthcare access for generations into the future, compounding our impact over time. Okay, that's pretty good. Notice that while we used all three original weighing mechanisms, we also incorporated aspects of time frame to enhance our magnitude and scope weighing by showing that the impacts of a recession are temporary and thus less significant compared to the impacts of healthcare access. However, while these mechanisms allow us to compare impacts face to face, we can also make interactive weighing mechanisms that take one impact and use it to influence access to another impact. Now, there are two main interactive weighing mechanisms. First, there's linking into an impact, or getting a link in to their argument. Now, this is saying you outweigh because your argument leads to both your impact and their impact, or even that your impact could cause their impact. Either way, you access both impacts while they only access one. Second, there's making a short circuit or prerequisite argument, where if you win your argument, your opponent can't win theirs. Now, these might take the form of less strict relationships, saying that winning one argument might mitigate or down the line take out another argument's impact, which still gives your opponent some space for offense. Either way, the focus is to take out another argument using your own. So let's go back to our healthcare example, but this time let's flip it. And let's say that a recession outweighs increased healthcare access and weigh it using interactive weighing mechanisms. First, recessions mean people have less money, and healthiness can be expensive, so health problems get worse overall. Second, recessions short circuit healthcare access by reducing incomes all over the world, hurting medical product supplies, and spiking costs, ultimately preventing access to healthcare. Okay, while both of these work, notice the relative strength of the short circuit. Even if your opponent makes the previous weighing arguments about probability, magnitude, and scope, the short circuit gives the judge a strong reason to prefer the recession's impact. Focusing on the second weighing argument and summary and final focus here would definitely be the winning move. So, coming back to the question of the video, what are arguments and how do we make them in debate? At its core, an argument is a claim with a warrant or an explanation. Now, this could be as simple as saying the sun is not purple because we observe that it does not emit the color purple. In debate rounds, we walk in having to defend a claim about the world, with the affirmative arguing that something should be done and the negative arguing against that. Both sides defend these claims with subsequent arguments that we can organize into offense and defense. Offensive arguments, like contentions, link and impact turns, and disadvantages, give judges a positive reason to prefer one side's overall claim over another and declare them the winner. Defensive arguments, including mitigations, non-unique stealings, terminal defense, and impact defense, directly refute other arguments in the debate and take them out of consideration for the judge. Offensive and defensive overviews can provide broad responsiveness when a set of offensive arguments, usually contentions, can just be addressed together. Now, alongside offense and defense, we can weigh different arguments against each other using both standard weighing mechanisms like probability, magnitude, scope, and time frame, and interactive weighing mechanisms such as Lincolns, short circuits, and prereqs. And finally, frontlines are arguments read in defense of constructive speeches or cases, with spikes being embedded frontlines to preemptively take out responses. This is the fundamental set of arguments that you should familiarize yourself with in public forum debate. So, where do we go from here? In the following videos on flowing and the 3 pillars of debate, judges, preparation, and strategy, keep these argument types in mind and be willing to refer to what you're learning in this video through to your others. A strong toolkit of articulated argument types gives us the room to build specific debate skills as we continue. For example, in our next video on flowing debate rounds, we'll cover specific applications of these concepts, so it's easier for you to organize your notes when you're debating. While it starts complex, the comprehensiveness of this approach will make things simple down the line. All of the fundamentals will thus continue to build on this video's basic concepts to draw out what PF is really all about.